Well, good Friday morning. I hope that you've had a great week. So I had an opportunity to do some traveling this week. Noticed that a lot of crops are starting to come out of the field and also starting to hear a really common conversation. What are we going to do about dry fertilizer this fall? If you've called down to your fertilizer supplier lately, you know that your phosphorus and your potash are both running pretty high, especially when we look at kind of where commodity prices are. I think it becomes a key conversation to what is your plan for this next year as we start to think about our fall applied dry fertilizers. Specifically today, I thought we should talk a little bit about phosphorus, because as we think about phosphorus and as we think about potassium and potash, and we think about, are we going to pull back in the fall and let us mine, right? It's a key word, just simply meaning that as you guys have been slowly building up your fertility levels, maybe this is a year that we need to think about pulling out of that account. But I think there's some key things that we want to consider before we just simply say, hey, I'm going to pull back, I'm going to cut back, I'm just going to look at crop removal rates. I want us to think about, well, what's actually happening in the soil? And as we understand what are the different forms of phosphorus that are in the soil, what are the different pools or way that those forms are going to be held, and then a key thing, how can I enhance my plant's ability to take those nutrients up? So join me this morning as we spend a little bit of time and dig in to the idea of phosphorus. So first of all, let's think a little bit about the different pools of phosphorus that are found within our soil. And when I say pools of phosphorus, it's just the idea of the different ways that phosphorus is going to be held in our soil. First of all, if you could look at total phosphorus in our soils, in a lot, not in all of them, but in a lot of our soils, we have large amounts of phosphorus that are going to be found in here. Key thing is though, a lot of that phosphorus, in fact, a lot of times we're talking a handful of percent, is only going to be available to our plants. So when we think about the different forms of phosphorus in our soil, let's call them our pools if we want to. The first pool is going to be that plant available pool of phosphorus. And that is simply the phosphorus that can be held in that solution of the soil that the plant roots are going to be able to get to, they're going to be able to interact with, and they're going to be able to pull that phosphorus out. Unfortunately for us, that plant available pool is typically the very smallest pool that's available. The other two pools will be the organic phosphorus. And when we think about organic phosphorus, we can just think about organic matter that's going to be in the soil. However, it is not in a plant available form. So think a lot about like nitrogen, right? We can have nitrogen in the organic matter form. Even though it's in the soil, it's not plant available. The last pool, if we think about the organic, the plant available, that last one is going to be this large inorganic pool that is not plant available. And now when we think, well, what is that going to be? Oftentimes, depending on our pH and the different minerals we have in our soil, we could have phosphorus that's tied to iron, phosphorus that's going to be tied to calcium, simply not in a form that's available for the plant to take up. And a lot of phosphorus in this inorganic pool can also be held within the kind of structure or the idea of the soil itself. We have some of these heavier soils, we can be holding on to a lot more phosphorus in that structure. So that's our three pools that we want to think about. The very small plant available, the organic pool, which is just simply going to be an organic matter but not available, and then also that inorganic that's not available as well. Now that we understand the pools that our phosphorus can be found in within the soil, I think it's important that we talk about, well, how can we move phosphorus between those different pools? How can we help to move it into that plant available pool? So let's start with the idea of the phosphorus that's going to be found in an organic matter. The way that we're going to talk about with this is very similar to nitrogen. We have enzymes that are secreted by bacteria that can help break down the organic matter that we have in our soil and then release that into our plant available forms of that inorganic phosphorus. But again, it's driven a lot by bacteria, fungi, and enzyme secretions. An interesting thing, as we go to the inorganic pool, the large one that is not plant available, we also see this idea of bacteria and fungi again. However, a lot of times when we're on this large inorganic pool, instead of it being enzymes, we're actually looking at organic acid secretion. And this organic acid secretion is actually going to kind of liberate, if we want to think about it that way, and release that phosphorus into the plant available pool. A key thing that I see both of them, we have to be paying attention to what the soil biology is going to do, right? When we start to think about how are we going to maximize this phosphorus uptake, we want to first pay attention to what's happening in the soil, because a healthy, active soil microbiome is really going to help us move the phosphorus from either that organic or that plant unavailable inorganic into that plant available pool that we can think about being in the center where the plants are going to be able to take up those nutrients. So as we think then about the availability or the pools, we understand that that soil microbiome is going to be so important with those enzymes and organic acid secretions that really help us to move that form of the phosphorus. We also then need to think about, well, how is my plant going to take that up then? Because we can have everything else going right and still not be able to harvest that phosphorus. So when we think about how plants are going to pull phosphorus up, there's really three things that we can think about with that phosphorus. The first one is simply going to be diffusion. Diffusion through the soil just simply means I'm moving across that soil from high concentration to low concentration, but it also says how big is the molecule, because the bigger the molecule that's moving, the slower that rate of diffusion. Well, we know in most soils, right? I've learned that across the board, not everything, but in most soils, our phosphorus has a very, very slow rate of diffusion. Okay, so that's the first way. The second way that we can think about it is what's called a mass flow. And mass flow simply means this: water moves into the soil and it carries those nutrients across, right? Mass flow across those roots so that we can take it up. That's great when we have rain. Right now, we're in a D2 drought where I am at home. However, we also know that in most of our heavier soils, the mass flow of phosphorus is very low as well, which leaves us to our third, and that is simply root intercept. What does root intercept mean? It simply means that all these wonderful roots that we're looking at right here have to grow and come in contact with it. So when I think about phosphorus uptake, it really comes into play those three things. I know my phosphorus is diffusing very, very slowly and over very short distances. I can have some mass diffusion if we get rain, but again, not a major pathway for phosphorus. And then I have root intercept. Well, what does that really tell me? Well, it says if I want to maximize my crop's ability to pull phosphorus out of the soil, I have to be setting my roots up for success. Well, what does that look like? Well, it means we got to get our crops off to a good start. Anything we can do that enhances our root growth is going to help us there. But even in a best case scenario, a lot of times our roots are only occupying a few or a handful percent of the total soil volume. This is where I personally love to talk about mycorrhizal fungi. Why mycorrhizal fungi? Mycorrhizal fungi will actually infect these roots. Now, we can't see it right here, but what they do is they form all of these little filaments, and these filaments increase the volume of my root structure. So now all of a sudden I'm going from maybe a handful percent, 3, 4, 5% of the soil volume in my root structure to I have yards and yards and yards of filaments from my mycorrhizal fungi that are growing off the roots. But not only does mycorrhizal fungi increase the rooting volume, it also secretes enzymes and acids that are going to help solubilize those nutrients. I like to think about mycorrhizal fungi literally are carving out those nutrients, specifically today, phosphorus. And by carving out those nutrients, they're able to bring them into the plants so that our plants can utilize it. So again, as we're thinking about this coming fall, and I understand, man, our fertilizer prices are high. I completely understand, man, our commodity prices, they just don't seem balanced out with where dry fertilizer is. And our conversations go to, am I going to pull back? If we're going to pull back, and if you've spent the time to build that soil bank, this may be the year to do it. However, I want to encourage you, set your plants up for success. Think about the big picture. What am I doing for my soil biology? What am I doing to enhance rooting structure? What am I doing to increase my volume of my roots with something like a mycorrhizal fungi? And can I use products? And maybe this is the year to look at some of these products that help us to solubilize phosphorus, right? The idea of specific enzymes that are going to help us break down what we find in the soil and put it in that plant available form. Because again, we want to get things off to the best start that we can, and it's okay to pull on the bank if we've gone ahead and we've paid it for a few years into the soil, but we still have to maximize what's happening in the soil if we want to maximize our yield at the end of next season. I hope this gives you some things to think about. I think it's a bigger conversation than just simply saying, hey, I'm going to pull back a little bit this year. The conversation becomes, what all am I going to be doing to still maximize that yield? Because even next fall, we're going to have bushels in order to make sure that all the payments are made. I hope that you've had a great week. Let me know what you're doing when you're thinking about your dry fertility program this fall.